welcome to week 8's lectures on Bram Stoker's Dracula. In today's session, I'll be discussing the idea of the Urban Gothic. I'll be revisiting issues related to the new woman, and I'll be finishing up by talking about Gothic monsters. Stoker draws us forcefully back to the most basic foundations of Gothic fiction and theatre, especially in Dracula, while simultaneously offering a zone of horror that vividly harbors a host of anxieties basic to Anglo-European white middle-class culture at both the fin de siècle of Stoker's time and our own turn of the century. For me, it forms no mere coincidence that 1897, the birth year of Dracula, was the 100th anniversary of the death year of Horace Walpole, the first writer to subtitle a novel Gothic story. These are the critical perspectives of Gerald E. Hogel. And what he states here is that Dracula firmly belongs to the foundational concepts of Gothic fiction and theatre, and he suggests that there is a particular domain of horror. He calls it the zone of horror in this novel that illustrates the anxieties that are particular to Anglo-European white middle-class culture. And he argues that these are particularly manifest at the turn of the 19th century, and he goes on to say that these anxieties keep recurring at the turn of centuries. He is referring to the next turn of the century, the 20th century, and he also draws a symbolic connection between the birth year of Dracula, the year in which Dracula died, and the death anniversary of Horace Walpole. The 100th death anniversary of Horace Walpole fell on the birth year of Dracula, and he says that there is a symbolic connection there because Walpole was the first writer to call his novel a Gothic story. So these ideas of Hogel make us think deeply about the originary narratives around this sub-genre called the Gothic. Stoker intensifies the most fundamental and lasting tendencies in the Walpolean Gothic, and does so, I would contend, nowhere more so than in Dracula. Even his alterations of the Gothic tradition, the ones most revealing of its culture at his own historical moment, are arresting fulfillments of the principal technologies, the modes of symbolization that emerge in the Gothic from the writings of Walpole through those of Radcliffe, Lewis, Polidori, Charlotte Bronte, to Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What Hogel tries to communicate through these ideas here on the slide is that even when Stoker is experimenting and coming up with new modes of Gothic technologies, what he is trying in reality to achieve is to continue the traditions of the Gothic that we have seen in writers such as Radcliffe, Lewis, Polidori, Bronte, up to Stevenson. So Stoker is very, very strongly rooted to the fundamental and lasting tendencies, the very basic tenets of the Walpolean Gothic. That's what Hogel argues in his work. Punch calls Dracula as the very weirdest of weird tales, and Stoker uses the figure of the vampire as thinly veiled shorthand for many of the fears that haunted the Victorian fin de siècle. Dracula becomes that vessel in which all the anxieties of the Victorian culture can be thrown in. So it's a very useful literary medium to rehearse and think through and act all the anxieties and problems of the turn of the century in Great Britain. Throughout the novel, scientific rationality is set against folklore and superstition. Old Europe is set against modern London, and traditional notions of civilized restraint and duty are threatened at every turn by the spread of corruption and wanton depravity. We have been talking about the contrast between old Europe and modern London. London seems to be at the forefront of change, so there is a conflict between the fast pace of modernity and the timeless ancient traditions of old Europe. So there is this friction that's always there in Gothic narratives between the present and the past, and we can see that in Dracula, the civilized society, which is represented by restraint, normality, ordinariness, rationality, and discipline. And these characteristics are threatened at every turn by depravity and corruption, moral corruption and physical depravity, which are represented by old Europe and which is embedded in the figure of the Count and on vampirism. Dracula's forays into London, for example, and his ability to move unnoticed through the crowded streets while carrying the potential to afflict all in his path with the stain of vampirism, play upon late Victorian fears of untrammeled immigration. The latter was feared as leading to increased levels of crime and the rise of ghetto communities. Dracula creates several layers in the metropolis, including one in Chicksand Street, Whitechapel, an area notorious for Jack the Ripper murders of 1888, and one in Bermondsey, the location of Jacob's Island, the low-life rookery immortalized by Charles Dickens in Oliver Twist. The crowded streets of London is very important because we have talked about how slum living poor, the vagrant poor, are associated symbolically with vampirism, with vampires. And it is important for us to notice the connection between the ghetto communities, immigrant population, and the figures of vampires in Dracula's in Dracula and his followers. So one can see that there is a connection between Dracula, vampirism, and the crowded population in slums, in ghettos. In fact, the pockets of the poor in metropolis, which is associated with not just poverty but also crime, is also symbolically communicated to, is also symbolically connected to the idea of moral and physical depravity and degeneration. And it's very important to remind ourselves of the Jack the Ripper murders of 1888. Because of the association between crime and poverty, and the location of crime, which is Whitechapel, which is notorious for being a ghetto community. The Ripper murders had created a storm of hysteria in the press, with the local Jewish community bearing the brunt of the outburst. The secretive nature of the Jewish ghetto was also cited as a reason why the murders were never solved, with the Jews seen as having close ranks around one of their own number who had committed the crimes. Such fears, which Dracula mirrors very closely, ultimately lay behind the introduction of the Aliens Act of 1905, which was put in place largely to stem immigration from Eastern Europe. The bottom line is that there is apparently a connection between crime and immigrant communities, which is reflected in Stoker's Dracula. And Greg Buswell suggests here that due to that kind of perception in society, the Aliens Act of 1905 was put in place, particularly to reduce immigration from Eastern Europe, and it's very significant that Dracula is from that part of Europe, and he symbolizes a range of associations ranging from crime, depravity, degeneracy, and possibly poverty as well, which I discussed in the previous lectures in relation to a particular critic. The act of vampirism itself, with its notion of tainted blood, suggests the fear of sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis, and more generally, the fear of physical and moral decay that was believed by many commentators to be afflicting society. Towards the end of the book, the character of Mina, who stands for everything Stoker sees as morally upright and respectable, observes the Count as a criminal and of criminal type. Nordau and Lombroso would so classify him. Vampirism refers to a set of attributes which we discussed in our previous lectures. It stands for taintedness, it stands for sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis, and it also more broadly stands for physical and moral decay, deterioration, degeneracy. And these are considered to be some of the factors which are afflicting society. And in the novel, Mina, who is the symbol of everything that's pure and upright and respectable, condemns the Count as a criminal. She argues that scientific experts such as Nordau and Lombroso would classify the Count Dracula, as belonging to the type of the criminal. The Hungarian social critic Max Nordau, Nordau's influential book Degeneration, an impassioned attack on what he regarded as the prevalent air of hysteria and moral decline in Western Europe, had been translated into English in 1895. Degeneration was dedicated to the Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso, whose work used a similar pseudo-Darwinian language to analyze psychology of the criminal mind. Here we can see some of the scientific texts and scientific researchers who could have influenced Stoker's narrative of Dracula. The Hungarian social critic Max Nordau's book Degeneration was dedicated to Cesare Lombroso, who was an Italian criminologist, and he uses a kind of a pseudo-Darwinian language to study the mental makeup of criminal minds. And what is pointed out by the Hungarian social critic is that there is a kind of a decline, there is a very strong anxiety in Western Europe about the decline of the human psyche, about degeneracy. So all these kind of anxieties and fears about the future of the human race would have strongly influenced Stoker. In an era noted for its foppish dandies, its pleasure-seeking aesthets, and the rise and fall of brilliantly flamboyant figures such as Oscar Wilde, Stoker is deliberately aligning Count Dracula with everything respectable late Victorian society would have regarded as morally corrupting, criminal, and perverse. We know about the late Victorian culture of dandyism. We know about the foppish dandies, and Oscar Wilde can be categorized as belonging to one as belonging to that kind of category. He's brilliant but flamboyant. Oscar Wilde is a great writer, but we associate dandyism with him. And it is particularly important to notice that Stoker is associating Count Dracula with everything that respectable Victorian culture would find it repulsive. The count is corrupt, criminal, and perverse, and all these factors would have really disgusted respectable late Victorian society. Some critics have argued that Stoker uses the character of Lucy to attack the concept of the new woman, a term coined towards the end of the Victorian era to describe women who are taking advantage of newly available educational and employment opportunities to break free from the intellectual and social restraints imposed on them by a male dominated society. Those who took a hostile attitude towards the new woman saw her either as a mannish intellectual or going to the opposite extreme, an oversexed vamp. We have been talking about the representation of femininity in Dracula. We have seen how certain characters were condemned and certain characters were held up for praise. And we also saw, how even those characters which are morally apparently very respectable are become problematic in some respects, especially in relation to Dracula and so on. So we are kind of revisiting the idea of femininity, the idea of the role of women once again in this novel. Many critics have seen, um, have observed that the novel is very, very critical of the concept of the new woman. They say that the representation of Lucy is an indirect attempt to attack the idea of the new woman. And what is a who is a new woman? A new woman is a woman who makes use of available educational and employment opportunities to become economically and morally independent, to one who tries to break free of the patriarchal control under which she has been controlled. So the hostility towards new woman became manifest in these ways. That is, she would be seen either as a mannish woman, or she would be seen as an oversexed vamp, somebody who is indulging in excessive sexuality. So this is how the new woman was attacked, as lacking in feminine qualities or becoming excessively sexual. As Lucy joins the ranks of the undead, she herself becomes a vampire, leaving her tomb by night to feed upon a succession of defenseless children in a parodic distortion of the Victorian ideal of maternal femininity. When confronted by Van Helsing after one such raid, Lucy behaves in a manner that would have been viewed as an affront to both femininity and motherhood. The one character which best exemplifies Stoker's attack on the concept of new woman would be Lucy. She becomes undead, she is turned into a vampire, and she goes out at night and feeds on helpless children. And this act becomes a very disturbing parody of the role of Victorian femininity and motherhood. And Lucy becomes the anathema to one of the foremost ideals of a society that celebrates womanhood and motherhood. With a careless motion, she flung to the ground, callous as a devil, the child she had clutched strenuously to her breast, growling over it as a dog growls over a bone. For Stoker, Lucy's decline from the Victorian feminine ideal to the perceived selfish unnaturalness of the new woman is complete. This quotation shows that she is no longer a female, no longer a woman. She just becomes an animal who's feeding on a helpless child. She's compared to a dog that growls over a bone. So that is animalistic behavior on the part of Lucy. But critics argue that such a representation had been done by Stoker to indirectly point a finger of blame at the new woman who is trying to get out of the limited boundaries of femininity and motherhood that Victorian society had put her in. So this attack on the new woman becomes complete, according to Greg Buswell, through such representations of Lucy. Monsters are not only prohibitive, they are also infinitely attractive. By representing the promise of sexuality forbidden to Lucy by her mother and the marriage market, Dracula presents an attractive, if taboo model of sexual freedom. But as we have seen, he's also attractive to Mina, not because of sex per se, but because of Mina's own vexed relationship to knowledge. Now let's talk about the idea of monsters, Gothic monsters in Dracula. Monsters in Gothic narratives and in Dracula too are very, very attractive. Count Dracula is very not just prohibitive. We don't just become repulsed by Dracula. There is also an infinite fascination towards him by the characters in the novel. Lucy and Mina are restricted by their feminities in different ways. Lucy is restricted by her mother and the marriage market, and Mina is restricted by not being allowed welcomed into domains of knowledge. So, because of their restrictions, there is a desire on their part, in their own ways, to to somehow get out of their restrictions by being attracted towards this figure. In Lucy's case, it's very overt. She enjoys the idea of sexual freedom, and Mina, even though she is repulsed by Dracula, there are certain moments in the novel when she is also not too resistant to his attractions. Due to Van Helsing's repeated efforts to infantilize her through paternalistic injunction, knowledge itself has become taboo for Mina. Tabooed objects are those to which we summon up not a simple emotional reaction, but a dialectical one in which the mind oscillates between attraction and repulsion, worship and condemnation. In his attempts to protect Mina and mystify his own common sense, knowledge Van Helsing has rendered knowledge itself taboo for Mina. We have seen in the previous lectures as to the kind of surveillance that is imposed on not just Lucy but also to a great extent on Mina by Van Helsing. So what Van Helsing is trying to do in the narrative is infantilize Mina, treat her as a juvenile, treat her as a child that needs to be protected. He is being fatherly, but what essentially happens is a manifestation of patriarchal control over Mina's mind, and knowledge itself becomes a taboo for Mina because of the efforts of Van Helsing and other men. And tabooed subjects are very interesting because towards the tabooed object there is, according to Punter, an emotional reaction of attraction and repulsion. One is simultaneously attracted by it and repulsed by, disgusted by it. We try to worship and condemn it simultaneously. So Dracula becomes one such tabooed object for certain female characters in the novel. Knowledge becomes such a tabooed object for Mina. She is attracted and repulsed by it. And even more paradoxically, proper femininity itself has become unclear. All she wants is to help her husband to solve the mystery of what happened to her friend and to feel that her work as lady journalist is useful. Yet, in the context of Van Helsing's suspicious case and the conservative press's pillaring of the new woman as the great threat to society, Mina's self image has become a site of emotional ambivalence. Mina's self-image has become a site of emotional ambivalence, not unlike Lucy's taste for extramarital sex. So you can see in what kind of a double bind that Mina and Lucy are in this narrative, in this Gothic narrative. All Mina wants to do is to be very useful and helpful to her husband and to find out about the unfortunate circumstances that had befallen her friend Lucy. and yet she is always already within the suspicious gaze of Van Helsing, and she's also apprehensive about the kind of attack that the conservative press had made towards the idea of the new woman. The new woman is seen by the press as the greatest threat, the most disturbing factor in society. Therefore, Mina's mind is full of fear and anxiety. It has become a site of ambivalence towards what is the right thing for a female to do, and that kind of problematic frame of mind is detrimental towards the health of the psyche. Now, both the side of tabooed knowledge as well as sexual potential, Dracula has become even more attractive to his next victim. This corporal fluidity, the simultaneity of anxiety and desire, ensures that the monster will always dangerously entice. Comprised of all Van Helsing's worries and prohibitions, all of Lucy's longings and desires, and all of Mina's musings, ambitions, and devouring anxiety, Dracula has become the perfect monster of the Victorian fin de siècle. So Prescott and Giorgio very impressively and convincingly suggest that Dracula has become this tabooed object. He represents a lot of taboos in society. He represents knowledge that is taboo for Mina. He represents sexual freedom that is taboo for women in general, and particularly for Lucy. So you can see that Dracula can be the embodiment of a range of anxieties, cultural anxieties of late Victorian society. Therefore, he is the perfect monster because, as we have seen, taboos are very attractive as well as repulsive. This combination of anxiety and desire in relation to a tabooed object makes it very attractive, and therefore Dracula has become this perfect monster, the best monster, because it is attractively dangerous, and it represents all the fears of late Victorian society. Whereas the Gothic narrative demands closure, it also requires that the closure fail to contain the transgressions the story has put into play. The monster of prohibition is also always the monster of attraction, a figure with whom we identify, a site of attractive, repulsive desire. The text is compelling precisely because the formation of monsters, and thus the ideological definition of what counts as human, is a never-ending performative process. All narratives seek closure. Gothic narratives demand closure as well. Yet, we also see that such narratives also require that the closure does not really necessarily contain, delimit the transgressions that the narrative has put into play in it. So while there is closure, the closure does not always close off all the transgressions in the story. The monster of prohibition, the really dangerous monster, continues to be an attractive monster with whom the readers identify, with whom the characters inside the novel also identify. That the monster becomes a tabooed object of attraction as well as repulsion. Gothic narratives are very compelling. They're very attractive for this reason. That is, the formation of monsters, the representation, the eruption of monsters, are very fascinating to the humans, because they always because the humans find a fascination as well as a repulsion. They tend to identify with such figures, and therefore it's a performative process, the process of identification and repulsion, that the readers find through Gothic narratives is a continuing, ongoing process. Thank you for watching. I'll continue in the next session.